7:45 in the morning. September 19th, 1944. A ridge in eastern France called Hill 246. First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper cannot see his own hand in front of his face. The fog is that thick. What is coming toward him, invisible in that fog, 45 tons, a piece of steel and gun and diesel, is a column of German Panther tanks. What Leiper does not know is that in less than 1 hour, one of his sergeants, a man named Henry Hartman, is going to do something in a vehicle the Germans called a toy. Something so improbable that 80 years later, historians are still arguing about how it happened. This is the story of the Purple Heart Box and the men who made it the deadliest killer in the entire United States Army. The fog had come in before the sun. It rolled off the low ground east of Ericourt in the small hours of that morning, slow and heavy, filling every ditch and hollow across the Lorraine plain. By 6, a man standing in an open field could not see the tree line at its edge. By 7, he could not see the man beside him. The rain had been falling for 3 days. Now, the sky itself seemed to have come down to the ground. On the reverse slope of that low ridge, the maps called Hill 246, roughly 800 yards southeast of a stone village named Réchicourt-la-Petite. 4 American vehicles sat with their engines idling. They were low and open-topped, painted olive drab, streaked black with rain. The men inside could not see the vehicles behind or in front of them. They could only hear engines, breathing, the tick of metal cooling and warming, the soft click of a radio squelch. Edwin Leiper, in the lead vehicle, was watching a wall of white nothing, and he was listening. Somewhere below him, hidden in that same fog, the tanks were coming. He did not know how many. He did not know how far. He knew only that they were German, and that the 4 vehicles under his command had been sent here to stop them. Each of those vehicles weighed 17 tons. Each carried a 76mm gun. Each was wrapped in armor so thin that a heavy machine gun round, fired close enough, could punch straight through it. 13mm on the hull, half an inch, less than the thickness of a man's little finger. The turret above Leiper's head had no roof. Rain dripped onto his map case, onto the radio, onto the empty brass casings rolling under his boots. This was the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked vehicle of the entire Second World War, 55 miles an hour on a good road. And right now, on this ridge, in this fog, it was crawling at walking pace toward a fight it should not, by any reasonable measure, be able to win. Before we go any further, you need to understand 3 things. You need to understand what this machine actually was. You need to understand what kind of men climbed into it. And you need to understand how a Panther tank, the finest medium tank fielded in the West by Nazi Germany, ended up on a foggy road in eastern France, alone, with no one coming to help. Start with the machine. The M18 was not born from optimism. It was born from panic. In the summer of 1941, the German panzers were burning through Europe, and the American army had nothing that could stop them. A colonel named Andrew Bruce, soon to be promoted to brigadier general, was given a mission that sounded philosophical. Design a vehicle that could kill tanks, not fight them, kill them, and do it with something other than armor. Bruce believed something that most tank officers of his generation refused to believe. He believed speed was armor. He believed that a vehicle fast enough to avoid being hit did not need steel to stop a shell that never arrived. He wanted a gun that could kill at long range. He wanted a machine that could disengage before the enemy could react. He wanted, in effect, a hunter, not a soldier. Buick built it. The Buick Motor Division of General Motors, in a factory in Flint, Michigan, that had been making automobiles a year earlier. They gave it an automatic transmission, one of the first ever fitted to a military vehicle. They gave it an air-cooled radial aircraft engine, the Continental R975, adapted from the same engine that had powered biplanes and early Army trainers. They stripped the weight down until the vehicle could barely be called armored at all. Half an inch on the hull, no roof on the turret, a 76-millimeter gun that, at close range, could kill a Panzer IV without difficulty, and at any range at all, could not reliably penetrate the front of a Panther. The crews saw the specifications, and they gave the machine names. Some came from infantrymen who had watched Hellcats burn. Some came from Sherman tankers who refused to trade seats. The names were not kind, but the one that stuck, one the crews themselves used in letters, home, and in quiet conversations behind the lines, was the simplest. They called it the Purple Heart Box. By the summer of 1944, when the first M18 battalions came ashore in Normandy, some senior American commanders were actively trying to stop the program. Omar Bradley's staff at 1st Army Headquarters looked at the armor, looked at the gun performance against Panthers, and concluded that sending men into battle in this vehicle was, at best, optimistic. That was the machine. Now understand the men. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had come ashore in Normandy in late July. By September, they had been fighting continuously for almost 2 months. 3 companies, 36 Hellcats, about 800 men. Company C was commanded by a captain named Tom Evans. His first platoon was led by a young lieutenant from a small town somewhere in the middle of America, Edwin Leiper. Leiper had 4 vehicles under him and 20 men. His lead tank was commanded by a sergeant named Stacy. His last tank in the column, the 4th in line, was commanded by a sergeant whose name has survived in the records for a reason we will come to. His name was Henry R. Hartman. None of these men were ordinary tank crewmen. They could not afford to be. In a Sherman, a mistake could cost you a track. In a Hellcat, a mistake cost you 5 men. The machine did not forgive, and the crews who had survived from Normandy to Lorraine, 3 months of continuous combat in an open-topped vehicle with no armor worth the name, were not the men who had started that summer. They were what remained after the machine had done its own selection. Now understand how the Germans arrived. By early September, Lieutenant General George Patton's 3rd Army had done something no Allied force in Europe had done before. It had covered 400 miles from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Moselle in less than 5 weeks. Its lead formation, Major General John Wood's 4th Armored Division, was so far ahead of every other Allied unit that its supply trucks needed 2 full days just to reach the nearest fuel depot and return. And then the gas ran out. Not gradually, not partially. The 3rd Army's daily fuel allocation collapsed from 400,000 gallons to 31,000, enough to move a single division. Not an army. Here is the first thing that most people do not know about Aracourt. The reason Patton stopped was not the German army. It was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, 400 miles to the north, launching Operation Market Garden. Every available gallon of fuel in the Allied logistical network was being funneled toward the airborne drops in Holland. Patton's tanks sat where they had stopped, in the rolling farmland around Aracourt, and waited for gasoline that would not come. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command A of the 4th Armored, set up a defensive perimeter. He had Shermans, Stuarts, the 36 Hellcats of the 704th Artillery, and a lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, from a Sherman he had named Thunderbolt. Abrams was 30 years old. By September of 1944, he was already on his 4th Thunderbolt The previous three had been shot out from under him. They dug in. They waited. And what was coming had been assembled 15 days earlier at a training area called Wildflecken in eastern Germany. On September 4th, the German High Command activated the 113th Panzer Brigade under a Prussian aristocrat named Colonel Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf. 42 Panther tanks, factory fresh, some still wearing transport grease from the assembly line, 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers, enough men and machines to fill a road column stretching over a mile. On paper, it was a fist. Here is the second thing most people do not know. According to the German records themselves, the 113th Panzer Brigade was missing almost everything that made a German panzer division dangerous. It had no reconnaissance battalion. It had no dedicated artillery. It had no engineered troops. The German High Command had, in the words of one post-war analyst, forgotten every lesson they had learned about combined arms warfare and had gambled instead on the raw superiority of their tanks. The men inside those Panthers were the second problem. Most had never fought together. Some had never fought at all. They had been pulled from replacement depots, given abbreviated training, loaded onto trains, and shipped west under cover of darkness because Allied aircraft ruled the daylight sky. They had 2 weeks to learn each other's names. 2 weeks. On September 18th, the 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, a small, aggressive officer who had made his reputation on the Eastern Front, launched its counteroffensive. The plan was a classic pincer. The 111th Panzer Brigade would strike from the south. The 113th would strike from the east. Hammer and anvil. Between them, they would crush the 4th Armored Division and reopen the road to Nancy. Here is what the plan required. It required both brigades to arrive at the same place at the same time, in coordination. That is not what happened. During the night of the 18th, moving through the dark forests of Perroy toward its assembly area, the 111th Panzer Brigade lost its way. Whole companies of Panthers wandered off route in the woods. Radio contact broke down. When dawn came on the 19th, one entire half of the German pincer was not where it was supposed to be. Colonel von Seckendorf did not know this. He led his 42 Panthers out of their assembly area in the pre-dawn dark into the thickening fog, believing that his brother brigade was moving alongside him a few miles to the south. He was, in the most literal sense, attacking alone. He would not learn otherwise until the fight was already lost. And this is the strange, cold arithmetic that no comparison chart can capture. A Panther outweighed a Hellcat by 28 tons. Its frontal armor was 6 times thicker. Its long-barreled 75-millimeter gun could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. But a chart cannot measure the distance between a crew that has bled together for 90 days and a crew that met each other on a train platform 2 weeks ago. A chart cannot measure a brigade that got lost in the woods. A chart cannot measure fog so thick that a gun designed to kill at 2,000 yards has no target at 30. At 7:45 on the morning of September 19th, none of the men on Hill 246 knew any of this. Leiper knew only what he could hear. He heard engines. He heard the grinding of tracks somewhere down the slope. He heard rain on his own hull. Then, 30 feet in front of him, he saw a shape emerge from the white wall of fog. A gun barrel, the muzzle brake of a German tank gun. He had less than 3 seconds to decide what to do. 3 seconds. That was the margin. The barrel of the Panther's 75-millimeter gun was pushing out of the fog like something coming up from underwater. Leiper could see the muzzle brake. He could see the top edge of the mantlet behind it, 30 feet away. close enough that if the fog had thinned by another dozen paces, the German commander would already have been staring at him. Sergeant Stacy, in the lead Hellcat, saw it the same instant. He did not give an order. There was no time for an order. His gunner already had the traverse wheel in his hand. The turret swung, the gun found the shape in the fog, and the 76mm cannon fired. The muzzle flash lit the fog from the inside like a lantern. The round crossed 30 feet of wet air in a fraction of a second. It struck the front of the Panther, and the Panther stopped moving. Not a fireball. Not yet. Just a hard, metallic hammer strike. A jolt through 45 tons of steel. And something inside the German tank died. Maybe the driver. Maybe the transmission. Maybe both. The engine idled on. The tank sat there like a killed animal that had not yet been told. Behind it, another turret was rising out of the fog. Stacy's loader was already ramming the next round into the breach. The gunner adjusted. The second shot came less than 15 seconds after the first. It hit the second Panther and stopped that one too. 2 German tanks, less than half a minute. And then the third Panther in the German column found Stacy's Hellcat. The round that came back through the fog was not a warning. It was a hammer. It struck Stacy's vehicle low on the hull, and the impact walked through the crew compartment in a way that only men who have been inside an armored vehicle when it is hit can truly understand. The turret went out of alignment. 2 of the 5 men inside were wounded, but the engine kept running. The driver, half-deaf, working on instinct, threw the transmission into reverse and pulled off the ridge. Stacy would live, his crew would live, his Hellcat would be repaired. He did not know any of that yet. He knew only that his driver had gotten him out. The second Hellcat in the line, the one behind Stacy, caught the Panther that had killed Stacy's gun. A single round into the flank at close range. The German tank shuddered and went silent. 2 more Panthers further back in the column tried to reverse into the tree line. They did not make it. The Hellcats caught them turning, and the 76mm guns punched into their thinner side armor before the German drivers could complete the maneuver. 5 German tanks destroyed. 1 Hellcat damaged and withdrawn. Elapsed time less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Hold that number for a moment. 15 days to build the 113th Panzer Brigade. 15 days to pull the crews from replacement depots, to load the Panthers onto trains, to move them west under cover of darkness, to assemble them on the training ground at Wildflecken. 15 days for the German High Command to plan a counter-offensive designed to shatter the American advance in Lorraine. 5 minutes for 4 American vehicles with half an inch of armor to erase 5 of those Panthers from the war. But Leeper's fight was not over. It was not even close to over. He had 3 Hellcats left, and standing on that ridge with the fog pressing against his face, he could hear what the fog was hiding. More engines, more tracks, the unmistakable heavy grinding of armor moving in volume, somewhere below him, coming up the road from Réchicourt-la-Petite. He could not say how many. He could only hear. Now think for a moment about what he did next. Every instinct a man wearing 13 millimeters of armor should have was telling him to leave, to pull his 3 surviving Hellcats off the ridge and put distance between them and whatever was coming. He had already fulfilled his mission. He had blocked the road. He had killed 5 Panthers. He had every reason in the world to disengage. He did not disengage. He repositioned. He moved his 3 Hellcats to a slight depression on the neighboring high ground, a piece of dead ground that masked their hulls from anyone approaching along the road. He told his crews to hold, and he waited. What emerged from that fog over the next 20 minutes would test every lesson those crews had learned since Normandy. Now, before we go into what happened next, you need to understand something that no comparison chart of Panther versus Hellcat will ever tell you. And this is the third thing most people do not know about Aracourt. The German radio doctrine, on paper, was excellent. Every Panther in a company was equipped with a receiver. Company and platoon commanders had transmitters as well. In clear weather, in a well-drilled unit, German tank companies could coordinate faster than any Allied formation on the battlefield. But the men in these Panthers had never trained together in fog. They had 2 weeks. They had never practiced the specific, disciplined radio drills that would have allowed them, in visibility of 30 feet, to talk each other onto invisible targets. And the American crews on that ridge, the same crews that had fought since Normandy, knew each other's voices on the net the way you know the voice of a brother in a dark room. When Leiper spoke on his radio, his 3 surviving commanders did not have to ask him to repeat himself. They already knew what he was going to say. That is the gap. That is the invisible weight on the American side of the scale. Not steel, not gun caliber, not top speed. 90 days of shared combat translated into the twitch of a hand on a traverse wheel, the half-second decision of a driver, the calm voice of a lieutenant on the radio. The Panthers came on. Leiper, straining forward in his open turret, caught the outline of a turret moving along the road below the ridge. Then another. Then another. In clear weather, that column would have spotted the Hellcats from 1,000 yards out. At 1,000 yards, the Panther's 75mm gun was a death sentence. But this was not clear weather. At 100 yards in fog, the rules of armored combat change completely. The Panther cannot use its range advantage. Its crew cannot spot, range, and fire before a faster vehicle reacts. At 100 yards in fog, the engagement becomes a knife fight. And in a knife fight, the thing that matters most is not how much armor you carry. It is how fast you move. It is how quickly you fire. It is who sees whom first. Leiper's 3 Hellcats opened fire from the flank. The first rounds caught the German column driving in file. Panthers that had been rolling down the road, believing themselves to be moving through a rear area, suddenly found high-velocity shells slamming into their thinner side armor. 40mm on the hull, 60 on the turret sides. Armor the 76mm gun could penetrate cleanly at that distance. The lead Panthers stopped. Some tried to traverse their turrets toward the ridge. Others tried to reverse. The fog made coordination impossible. The Panther commanders could hear gunfire, but could not see where it was coming from. And every vehicle that turned to face one Hellcat exposed its flank to another. The Germans hit back. A 75mm round struck one of Leiper's Hellcats and killed it. The crew bailed out into the fog on foot, dragging their wounded, disappearing down the reverse slope toward friendly lines. Minutes later, a second Hellcat was hit. Another crew went over the side. That left one, Sergeant Henry Hartman's Hellcat, was still in the depression on the neighboring ridge, still firing. What Hartman did over the next several minutes is difficult to reconstruct with perfect precision, because the fog that saved his life also swallowed the details of the fight. But the after-action records confirm the result. From that single vehicle, 17 tons, half an inch of armor, an open turret filling with rain, Sergeant Hartman destroyed 6 German tanks. 6. Think for a moment about what that requires. Each shot means breaking cover. Each shot means the muzzle flash of the 76mm gun marks Hartman's exact position in the fog like a signal flare. Each shot means every surviving Panther crew now knows exactly where he is. And each shot means his driver has to move, reverse, reposition, find new cover, stop, let the gunner reacquire a target, fire again, and then move again. In a vehicle with no roof, no meaningful armor. A gun that, according to every technical manual, was not supposed to be able to kill a Panther from the front. 6 times Hartman did this. 6 times he broke cover. 6 times he fired. 6 times his driver got him out before the German turrets could swing to where the muzzle flash had been. Now, about that gun. Here is the fourth thing most people do not know about Aracourt. The American 76mm gun on the M18 had been designed with a special ammunition, a tungsten cored round designated HVAP, for high-velocity armor piercing. Fired at close range, HVAP could penetrate the front of a Panther. On paper. In practice, in September 1944, in Lorraine, HVAP barely existed at the front. Production was limited, distribution was slower. Most Hellcats went into battle carrying standard armor-piercing rounds that, by the specifications, could not penetrate a Panther's frontal glacis at any range, which means Hartman was doing what his manual said he could not do. He was killing Panthers with standard ammunition, in fog, at close range, from a vehicle that offered him nothing but speed and a gun. He was doing it because he was not shooting at the front. He was shooting at the flank, at the rear, and at a particular narrow seam that Hellcat crews had learned about the hard way, a weakness in earlier Panther models that some of the machines at Aracourt still carried. The small gap between the curved bottom of the Panther's gun mantlet and the flat plate on the front hull. A shell that struck that seam at the right angle did not bounce off. It deflected downward, punched through the 16 millimeters of roof armor above the driver's compartment, and killed the men inside. You could not make that shot at range. You could not make that shot under pressure unless you had practiced it until your hands knew it without asking your brain first. Hartman had practiced it. His gunner had practiced it. His driver had learned exactly when to move and exactly when to stop without being told. 90 days of combat had made them one machine with 4 men inside it. While Hartman was fighting his single-vehicle war on the ridge, something else was happening a few miles to the north. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams had been watching the situation develop through the fog from his Sherman Thunderbolt, listening to radio traffic from Colonel Clark's command post. He did not wait for orders. He did not ask permission. When the reports told him that Panthers were pushing through the sector, Abrams moved. A combined force from Companies A and B of the 37th Tank Battalion wheeled south, caught the German column in the flank, and destroyed 9 Panthers in a running engagement that cost 3 Shermans. Further west, Captain Kenneth Lamison, commanding C Company of the 37th, made a decision that would define the entire day. He raced 4 tanks 3,000 yards to a ridge west of Basange-la-Petite. He put them into ambush positions with their guns already laid on the road. 3 minutes after his crews finished digging in, 8 Panthers drove directly into the killing zone. 3 minutes. That was the margin between ambush and meeting engagement, and between American guns already aimed and German commanders and still trying to figure out where the enemy was. Lamison's 4 Shermans destroyed 8 Panthers without losing a single vehicle. This is what the Germans could not match. Not the tanks, not the guns, the system. A captain in the middle of nowhere, seeing an opportunity, moving 4 tanks 3,000 yards on his own authority, and being right. A lieutenant colonel counterattacking without waiting for orders. A lieutenant on a fog-bound ridge, repositioning his 3 surviving vehicles and telling them to hold. Nobody in the American chain of command was waiting for permission. The Germans, meanwhile, were fighting a dozen small battles in isolation. The 111th Panzer Brigade was still lost. Von Seckendorf, hours into a battle he did not yet know he was losing, still believed reinforcements were on the way from the south. They were not. And back on that fog-bound ridge, in the last Hellcat of Lieutenant Leeper's platoon, Sergeant Henry Hartman was reloading. The morning was not yet half over. The sky above the fog was beginning to change. The fog did not burn off all at once. It thinned the way old memory thins. First, the outlines of the far tree line came back, then the shape of the road, then a farmhouse 200 yards away that no one on the ridge had known was there. By mid-morning, a man standing on Hill 246 could see almost 1,000 yards down the slope for the first time in 3 days. And that was when the Germans found out what the fog had been hiding from them. Not more Hellcats, not more Shermans, the sky. The 4th Armored Division's field artillery battalions had been on the radio net all morning. They had been listening. Forward observers, working blind in the mist, had been tracking the sound of engines, the location of gunfire, the pattern of the fight. They had plotted grid coordinates against what their ears could tell them. They had been ready to fire for over an hour. They had only been waiting to see. Now they could see. The 105mm howitzers of the divisional artillery opened up in a coordinated fire mission. Shells began falling on German armor caught in the open between Réchicourt-la-Petite and Basange-la-Petite. Panther crews who had been trained to fight tank against tank had no doctrine for what to do when the sky itself turned hostile, and then the P-47s came. The 19th Tactical Air Command had been grounded all morning by the same weather that had grounded German reconnaissance. When the ceiling lifted, they were airborne in minutes. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, painted olive drab, wings loaded with rockets and 500-pound bombs. They came in low over the ridge lines, and they found what every ground attack pilot dreamed of finding, a column of enemy armor on open roads, with no air cover and no functioning anti-aircraft screen. The Panthers' 80 millimeters of frontal armor meant nothing against a 5-inch rocket striking the engine deck from above. Von Seckendorf's brigade began to come apart. By the end of the day on September 19th, 39 German tanks lay burning or abandoned on the fields and roads around Aricourt. The 4th Armored Division had lost 4 Hellcats. The ratio was not close to even. It was not in the same universe as even. And the battle was not over. Over the next 10 days, the 5th Panzer Army threw the remnants of the 113th Panzer Brigade, reinforced now by the 11th Panzer Division and the belated arrival of the 111th, against Colonel Clark's Combat Command A again and again. Each attack followed the same pattern: a thrust, an American counter, artillery, air, retreat. On September 23rd, near a village called Lagarde, southeast of Aricourt, Colonel Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf was killed in action. He was 47 years old. He had been the commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade for 19 days. He would be posthumously promoted to General Major. The remnants of his brigade were gathered into an ad hoc battle group under Lieutenant Colonel Erich Hartman. That battle group fought at Hill 318 and lost again. On October 1st, 1944, the 113th Panzer Brigade ceased to exist as a formation. Its shattered fragments were absorbed into the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Total time from activation to destruction, 27 days. By the time the battle ended, the Germans had committed roughly 260 armored vehicles to the Aricourt sector. They had lost most of them. The 113th Panzer Brigade was gone. The 111th was gutted. The 11th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced formations in the West, had been bled white. And back on the ridge above Raichicourt, on the morning after the first day of the battle, Sergeant Henry Hartman climbed down from his Hellcat and stood in the wet grass in his boots. His vehicle had been hit by small arms fire and shell fragments. Nothing heavier. 13 millimeters of steel had held, not because the steel had stopped anything, because the man inside had never stayed in one place long enough to be hit by anything the steel could not stop. 15 German tanks lay destroyed on the road, and the fields below Hill 246. Most of them were Panthers. 4 Hellcats had been engaged, 3 had been lost. Sergeant Stacy was alive. 2 other crews were walking back through the fog on foot. Hartman's Hellcat was the only one of the 4 still on its tracks. Now, before we close this story, understand what this fight was and what it was not. It was not the work of one man alone. The story that 6 Panthers were destroyed by a single Hellcat is true. It is documented. It is also the smallest possible frame around a much larger picture. Hartman fought because Stacy had already killed 2 tanks. Stacy fought because Leeper had put his platoon on that hill. Leeper was on that hill because Captain Dwight had brought him there. Dwight had brought him there because Colonel Clark had understood faster than any German officer that morning where the attack was actually going. And every one of them had been able to act, to move, to fire, to hold, to counterattack, because the American chain of command from colonel to sergeant trusted the man below him to make his own decisions. The Germans could not match that. They had better tanks. They had a longer gun. They had heavier armor. What they did not have was a 111th Panzer Brigade that showed up on time. What they did not have was a company commander who could move 4 tanks 3,000 yards without asking permission. What they did not have was a Panther crew that had lived long enough to know each other's voices on the radio. The men who won at Aricourt were not miracles. They were the survivors of a machine that had killed everyone slower than them. That is the hard part of this story. The M18 Hellcat finished the war with the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any armored fighting vehicle in the United States Army. 526 enemy vehicles destroyed, 220 Hellcats lost, 2.4 to 1. Nothing else in the American arsenal came close. Not the Sherman, not the M10, not the heavier M36 with its 90mm gun. That number should not exist. A vehicle with 13 millimeters of armor should not be able to compile a record like that. The historian Stephen Zaloga, one of the most respected authorities on American armor of the Second World War, examined the record and reached a conclusion. That sounds almost like a contradiction. The Hellcat's extraordinary combat performance, he wrote, was the product of its crews. Their training, their skill, their refusal to die in a machine that offered them nothing but speed and a gun. The design itself, he argued, was fundamentally flawed. The Army did not set out to build a machine that would select for elite crews by killing the rest. But that is what it did. And the men who built that record, most of them never knew the final number. They knew their own fights. They knew the sound of a Panther's. They knew the 2 seconds of silence before you found out whether your driver was fast enough. Follow the men forward. Colonel Bruce Clark, who had sent Leiper's 4 Hellcats to hold Hill 246, went on to command the defense of St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge in December. He retired years later as a 4-star general. He said more than once that Aricourt had proved something he had always believed, that the quality of the crew mattered more than the quality of the machine. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who counterattacked through Réchicourt that afternoon, went on to lead the spearhead that broke through to Bastogne that December, relieving the encircled 101st Airborne Division in what Patton called the finest feat of arms in the war. He would go through 7 thunderbolts before the war ended. He rose after the war to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army during Vietnam. When the Army designed the tank that would replace the Sherman's descendants in the 1980s, they named it after him, the M1 Abrams. The main battle tank of the United States today still carries his name. Major General John Wood, the man who had built and led the 4th Armored Division from Normandy to Lorraine, was relieved of command on December 3, 1944, after a disagreement with his corps commander. He never held a combat command again. He had built one of the finest divisions in the American Army, and he was sent home before it crossed the Rhine. Sergeant Henry Hartman, Sergeant Stacy, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, Captain Kenneth Lamison, Captain William Dwight, Captain Tom Evans. These men appear in the after-action reports of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 37th Tank Battalion. Their personal papers, if they wrote any, are scattered across attics and archives in the country they came home to. Most of them did not become famous. Most of them did not need to. And then, less than 2 years after Harricourt, the United States Army did something that says almost everything about how quickly institutional memory can be overwritten. It abolished the tank destroyer force, the whole doctrine, the whole idea. General Andrew Bruce's vision of a fast, lightly armored hunter that killed tanks with speed and gun rather than steel, the doctrine that Hartman and Leiper and Stacy had proved on Hill 246, was retired. The M18 Hellcat, the vehicle with the best kill-to-loss ratio in the entire American armored force, was declared surplus. Hundreds of them were sold or given away to nationalist China, to Yugoslavia, to Iran. Some of them would still be in service in foreign hands 40 years later, in wars nobody had imagined in 1944. The Germans mocked the Hellcat because they measured it the way they measured everything, by the thickness of its armor and the caliber of its gun. By those metrics, the M18 was a toy. By those metrics, they were right. But the metrics were wrong. Because the Hellcat was never designed to survive by standing still and absorbing punishment. It was designed to survive by being somewhere else before the punishment arrived. And the men who crewed it, the men who fought with no roof over their heads and a 2-second margin between life and death, every time they pulled the trigger, those men did not need 80 millimeters of steel to protect them. They had speed, they had nerve, they had each other. And on a foggy morning in Lorraine, on a low ridge above a stone village called Réchicourt-la-Petite, that was enough. 526 kills, 220 losses, the best record in the entire United States Army armored force. Built by the men nobody envied, in the machine nobody wanted, 1 2-second bet at a time. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it moved you, a like helps these men be remembered. It tells the algorithm that real history, American history, still matters. It helps this story reach someone whose father or uncle or grandfather might have ridden in one of these vehicles and never talked about it. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be honored if you joined us. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one, and I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, in an armored unit, in a Hellcat, in a Sherman, anywhere, tell me about them in the comments. These stories survive because people like you keep them alive. Thank you.